Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our presentation today. So I'll go ahead and present us real quick. So my name is Dr. Serenity Cercesión. This is Dr. Joey Hanna, and this is Bethany Young, who's a doctoral candidate. And today we'll be talking about mental health for trans and gender nonconforming gamers. So who are we? An important question. That's my name, of course. So I'm from Puerto Rico, and that's part of my identity. I'm a therapist, a gamer. I'm in a ton of different fandoms. Right now, probably Steven Universe, Adventure Time, ponies. Big ones. Yeah, thank you. Obviously, Zelda, as you can see. I'm not Linkle, though. I just want to make that clear. Just Link. So I'm glad some of you understood that. I do identify as queer. My pronouns are they and them. And for me, I think a value that I have as a clinician is I want clients and myself to just identify in a way that's congruent to them and validates them. So that's me. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Joey Hanna. I'm a staff psychologist at the University of Texas, and big into gaming, have been for a long time, and identify as a gay man, cisgender. My pronouns are he, him, and thank you to GX for these tags on our name tags. That's great this year. But a big part of where I come from is I want us to be able to use what we're passionate about, the things that we find strength in, to help us along the way as we're taking care of ourselves, because sometimes the world around us is not going to take good care of us. But another big part that's really important to me is building allyship from within the community. We often try to look outside of our community for allyship, but we also have to be allies to each other.
Hi, I'm Bethany Young. I'm a PhD student. I'm getting my PhD in clinical psychology. So that's pretty much my entire life right now. I identify as female, cisgender, and straight. And for me, as a training psychologist, I guess it's really important for my clients to kind of learn that it's important to not be afraid of who you are and to kind of just basically embrace yourself. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. So here's just a quick snapshot of what we wanted to talk about today, so that you can get a chance to know a little bit about what's going on in the trans community. As I mentioned, that building allyship is also part of this. So we're going to be speaking both to those of you in the audience who may identify as trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary, but also to our allies or those that are looking to build allyship. Let's see, what was the other part?
Well, some of the other things that we'll be doing too is just talking about mental health in general, the mental health system, and just ways for you to be able to get mental health services if that's what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. The other thing just to mention is there's a lot of really cool panels and other talks that are going on related to trans issues, so make sure to go there and support those folks as well. So we're kind of doing our thing here. We're focusing a lot on mental health and kind of touching on different issues that are going on in the gaming spaces. But if you want to get more in depth with those, make sure that you're going to some of these other panels and supporting them too. Get started.
Okay, so I'm just going to go over kind of a broad definition of what it means to be transgender. So transgender is just basically a term for people whose gender identity doesn't really fit with the typical associated societal norms that are assigned with their birth sex. But it's also important to note that trans is such a broad term, and that, I mean, there's a lot of variety of terms that also go within the trans community. And it's also really important to use the terms that are preferred by the individual. So that's why I really like the little tags that they gave us all. Thought that was great. Also, terminology varies between communities and cultures, so it's just really important to find out what just all the different people's terms that they prefer.
So I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and I think we talk about the controversy later. Or?
Yeah, next slide.
Yeah. So what's with the asterisk? First, I'm going to put out there, I know some people probably don't like it, so just bear with us if you're one of those people. Where it came from originally is it was supposed to be a search term in academia. So for example, if you're looking for an article, or even on Google, you can do this, and you put an asterisk, it'll find anything that starts with that term and ends with something else. Makes sense? So if you put in trans and you put in an asterisk, everything else will come up, like transgender or any other ending. That's what it was used for. So it was originally supposed to be more of like an umbrella term and more inclusive in the community for anyone who was not in the gender binary, basically.
So we found that this was important for us to talk about right from the get-go, because when we started to put this panel together, we were like, oh, we feel differently about this.
Yes.
And we realized that in different communities and in different areas across the country, we're finding that people feel differently about this asterisk. So some of you might be thinking the internet has spoken and we know how we feel about it, and some of you might think, but that's great, but my community, my local community feels differently. And so as part of this, when you go into gaming spaces, you don't necessarily know who you're interacting with, where they're from, and as you learn about them, you might need to have this conversation, even though in your mind it might be done. And so it's important to know that for some folks, this asterisk might be very problematic, it might be exclusionary, and for some people, it might feel more inclusive. And so you might have to have this conversation a lot, and for some of you, it might feel distressing. And so that can have an impact on your mental health, and we'll kind of go from there. But it is important to maybe have this conversation with people if you're reaching across the country, if you're reaching to different countries with your gaming experiences, you might need to talk about this. And we realized that we needed to as we were putting this together, so that was good.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was that honestly I never heard a problem with it so far, but I had actually been corrected many times when I didn't use the asterisk and been told to use it. So I think we both had opposite experiences when it comes to this. But like Joy was saying, I mean, basically it's figuring out what is more important to the person. I mean, using what term makes more sense to them and trying to make it inclusive, which is why for this presentation we decided that we're going to at least explain why we're using it and talk a little bit about the controversy between both.
Yep.
I see everyone loves the Bowser I can write down. So what are some difficulties in mental health in the gaming community? So one of them is bullying. Here is a non-exhaustive list. I'm sure you guys can come up with plenty more of things that you may or may not be called. I put this together with a friend of mine actually, and a lot of them are from Xbox Live. That's all I'm going to say. So this is important because especially people who are either trans or gender non-conforming or LGB or anything, I have noticed that there's just a lot of hatred being put towards people, especially when others can't identify what you are, to put it that way. So just know we're aware that these may be some of the terms that you've been called before.
Yeah. And that identity validation is one of those extremely important things in mental health, is that if you feel invalid, if you don't feel represented, which we'll talk about later, that can have a really negative impact on you when you're constantly feeling like I'm not represented, I'm not a person, and I'm being bullied out of spaces that are important to me. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about getting into mental health is that a lot of folks, when they come to see us, when they're coming into to get support, they're saying, why do I feel this way? I feel really shitty and I don't understand why. And a lot of times the message they get is, it's because of your identity, it's because of who you are. And that's really not the case. And so wanted to talk a bit about what those factors are that could be influencing your mental health, because some of those things you might have some control for and some of them you can't. So some of the external factors, these are things that are going on around you. A lot of them are related to what's called a minority stress model. And this is based on the idea that when you are part of a marginalized community, and if you have multiple layers of that in your life, depending on where your identities intersect, you have more and more stress. You have stress from broader communities, you have stress from within the community, and you can have all that stress build up into very, very intense ways. But one of the things that comes along with that external pressure is also a lack of representation, which that's one of those things you're probably going to hear about a lot throughout different panels over this weekend. So again, please make sure to go to those. But there's a lot of lack of support, a lot of lack of mentors. One thing that I talk about a lot, or that's come up a lot, is there are really not a whole lot of trans-identified folks in psychology. There are more and more now, thankfully, but there's really not a whole lot. And especially when you start to get into trans folks of color and start trying to recruit people, it's really hard to do. And that's because there aren't a lot of folks in there. And so always trying to encourage people, because it creates more support, creates more mentorship opportunities. But also bullying, as we mentioned, and again, just those external things that are happening around you, things that might be happening to you. And then where it becomes very harmful for your mental health, especially, is when you start to internalize those things, where we talk about internalized transphobia, homophobia, having reactions to oppression that are within yourself that say, I'm being told that I must be this, and so therefore I feel this way. And but the other thing that we wanted to mention too is that for some folks, you may also have other things going on with your mental health: depression, anxiety, things that may or may not be related to your gender identity. And if that's the case, that still doesn't mean that your identity is the problem. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's come up a lot in psychology and in the field, but wanted to make it clear that you can have things that are going on with your mental health and your emotional health that may be just an internal factor that's separate from your identity. It might just be a chemical imbalance. And addressing those things can be very different than trying to work through those external factors and the things that you've internalized throughout your life.
All right, so one thing I wanted to add is that it's important for us in the mental health field to not over-pathologize, right? So for example, what can happen to some people is that you go in, you see a therapist, and then they do assume that literally every single problem you have is because of your identity. So what we're trying to make it clear is that not necessarily. It could be that it's part of the reaction you're getting, in that there's so much prejudice and stigma that you are being mistreated, but that doesn't mean that your identity is the problem.
Yeah, and the hard part with mental health is we have this really stigmatized field, and so a lot of people have a hard time coming to work with mental health issues. Thankfully, that stigma is getting better, but until that changes, we're kind of having a hard time with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to give kind of a brief historical overview of basically how gender nonconforming individuals have been viewed in psychology. So an official diagnosis first appeared in the DSM-3, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so it's basically like the Bible of psychology. It first appeared in 1980, and it was known as gender identity disorder. However, gender nonconforming individuals have been noted as far back as the 1800s, so it's not like it just popped up in 1980. And then other concepts about gender have been known, as far back as Native and indigenous cultures, so yeah, nothing really too new. And the current state in the DSM-5 is currently known as gender dysphoria. And as you can imagine, there's a little bit of controversy over making basically gender identity issues as a mental disorder. So it was changed in the DSM-5 to become gender dysphoria because they tried to emphasize the idea that it's not your identity that is the disorder, rather than just how it doesn't fit within typical social norms. So they tried to change the DSM-5 a little bit to make it more, I guess, better for characterizing.
Yeah, I think they were trying to make it more open, right?
Yeah.
And they did include a little bit about things for children as well.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about this that becomes really important is this is the language that if you go to work with somebody in mental health, this is the language that they're going to have, but also the history that's behind it, and the history alone can be pretty damaging. But what becomes important about this is a lot of times this is your access to health care, which is kind of an awful thing to have to say, like, I'm diagnosing you with this mental health condition because now you can actually get treatment. And that comes up a lot. Where we're having to provide diagnosis in order for somebody to get care when, anybody else who is cis-identified could go to a doctor and just have health care and not have to worry as much about whether their insurance will cover it or that kind of thing. So it's important to know what kind of a system you're navigating if you are trying to get mental health care in your life at that point.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add right about what Joey was saying is that I just want you to know that's one of the reasons why we actually kept it in the first place. So there was talk about taking this out completely, but the reason that I think most of us agreed in the end was only for the healthcare part.
Okay, so talking about some of the issues that trans folks are facing in gaming, as we mentioned earlier, there's a huge problem with representation. And again, with representation, what people are getting the message is you're not important, you're not valid, and that has a huge impact on you. Not to mention bullying, threats, things that we've talked about before, major problems with transphobic remarks in chat. Have any of you played online games and seen this occur? Yeah. I see lots of angry nodding too, right? And what that says a lot is, again, you're not welcome here. You know, this is not a space for you. And if this is, like I was saying earlier, if this is your passion, if this is the thing that you love, and I'm guessing that's why most of you are here, then it's like you don't get access to it. And that can feel very unfair and very damaging, because for some of you, this might be the place where you can escape. This might be the place that can feel really good. And now you're having to interact with other people and they're treating you in this way. The other part is with constantly having to come out. Coming out, especially in online communities, can be constantly having to explain yourself, your identity, and that can get very tiresome. It can take up a lot of energy in your life. The one thing that I wanted to point out a lot too is with TeamSpeak. If you ever use audio chat related things with your gaming, this can be one of those places where it can bring up a lot of anxiety and a lot of difficulty to a person if they're concerned about being misgendered based on their voice. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit more later, but it does become a very important sticking point for folks when they're facing gaming, and what does that mean for their mental health when they're now having to face this anxiety every single time that they're wanting to play a game, something that they want to be enjoyable. So taking care of yourself, this becomes incredibly, incredibly important, because this is something where you can do within gaming, and it might be something that you have to do outside of gaming. If it's something that you're doing within gaming, this can be a cool place to find community. This can be a really great place to find the people who think like you, who feel like you, and who can provide more validation, more affirmation. And this can also be a cool place to explore what gender means to you, ways that you want to present your gender. And the hard part is it's still very binary. A lot of games where you might have this opportunity, you may or may not actually get to play with gender fully, but it may give you that opportunity in a safer way. The hard part with taking care of yourself is that it requires a lot of time and a lot of energy. Has anybody here heard of spoon theory? Okay, good. So this is one of those things that it's been in psychology for a long time, and then somebody came up with this idea and it hit the internet and just went. But it's actually really cool. I'm glad that it happened. So the idea behind spoon theory is that you have only so much energy that you can give in a day. And depending on how you're feeling, depending on how, some of the things that you're up against, you might be spending more and more spoons. So think of spoons as currency. And the more time, the more energy you're having to put into managing your time gaming, the fact that you're going to be on TeamSpeak, the fact that you're going to have to talk more about pronouns and possibly get misgendered, the fact that you might have to get on a bus, and that might be very, very difficult for you. You may have things that you're dealing with family. You might be a student and you're having to study. Like, all of these things require time and energy. And the more that you're having to put into those things, then all of a sudden you have this little itty bit that you can spend to actually feel good. And that can happen a lot. And so with spoon theory, what they're saying is, you're spending your currency, you're spending more spoons to get through the day, and then it's like, okay, I have a moment that I can take care of myself, and I have one left. And so that might not give you a whole lot of room to do these things.
Well, and I think also what comes up with gaming is that it should be a space for you to relax and interact with other people, but it's unfortunate that because of all the things that we're talking about, sometimes it turns into not a safe place anymore. And then what do you do if the thing that you enjoy doing so much you can no longer do just because of the way that people are treating you, right?
One thing that I often tell people to consider is that you have two ways that you can take care of yourself. You have some ways that can be on a daily basis. It's maintenance. It's things that you do in a small scale that you can do to manage your emotional health, things that you enjoy doing, things that might only take a couple of minutes. You know, if you have a moment to just sit and be peaceful, or have a moment that you can do deep breathing exercises. Some people think they're cheesy, I think they work. But if you have a moment to do small things like that, whether or not you're feeling bad, it's just about maintenance. It's like when you're trying to manage your physical health, build up your immune system. We do the same thing emotionally. Then you might also need things to be coping skills, things that you do in the moment. You've had a really awful moment, and now you need to do something to take care of yourself. The other thing that you can get with, and again, that can be with gaming. That could be one of those, I'm sure some of you have had like really hard day, all you want to do is play a game that you've been dying to play. And so that could be a way to do that. The other thing within gaming, as we mentioned, this can be a place to find good friends, find good allies, and then, as I mentioned, finding allies within our own community, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But one thing I did want to mention, there's a website called prescriptionpixel.com. Has anybody heard of it? I only found out about it very recently, but they catalog a lot of video games that are specifically either about mental health or that are more related to relaxation, self-care, these kinds of things that we're talking about based on what it is that you're dealing with. So if you get a chance, check it out. Again, it's prescriptionpixel.com.
Now that we've talked about all the stress around gaming, unfortunately, let's go back into what are some of the benefits. I mean, why do we do it in the first place? First of all, it's fun, obviously. If not, we wouldn't be doing it. And actually, it's interesting that people from the outside might not understand, as in non-gamers, but for gamers, I was reading some research about this, and interestingly enough, one of the reasons why it's fun is because people like competition, partly. People like to achieve something, or people like having friends, or working cooperatively. Like, it's more than just sitting in front of a TV and doing something, right? There's something behind that for us. Also, for people who are trans, or gender non-conforming, or gender queer, or whichever, games can let you express being another gender. I know for me, and I do identify as genderqueer, often I would be a gender that people would probably not expect in many of these games on purpose, because if I can't do that in real life, at least I can do it in this video game, right? And it's a way for you to test out, well, how does this feel for me? What does this mean? Also, you can find other people who have similar interests to you, or maybe even other people who identify similar to you. And I think the best one of all, of course, is coming to cool gaming conventions. You can come here, chill with a bunch of people, play new games, and meet people who are similar to you. So there are a lot of positive things behind gaming as well. So here's the problem. As we've already been talking about, there's basically little to no representation. Finding a trans or gender non-conforming character in a game is very, very difficult. There are a few, though. It's not that they don't exist. But even the few that exist, there is no ethnic or racial diversity pretty much across the board. And that's a problem too, because people who are in this community and also ethnic minorities, that's a problem that you can't find anyone that you can identify with. And even when you do have a character who meets this criteria, often they're a villain or they're a joke, people make fun of them, and that's like seen as the butt of the joke. Oh, there's a trans person over there who's, no one's gonna take seriously. Or here's the person who is a villain. And actually, for those of you who enjoy Zelda like me, I was thinking about the character not Wind Waker, Skyward Sword? The villain's name, I don't remember right now. Hear him, yes. And the entire time I was watching that individual, it felt like it was a joke to a lot of us. So it's very hard to see that. But that's pretty common. You see all these villains who are portrayed as one of us, basically.
Yeah, and then that, of course, has a very significant effect on mental health. When, again, you're looking around and saying, okay, is this how the world sees me? And is this the life I'm going to be navigating just simply because I'm trying to be myself?
Which is too bad, because if we had characters that were more of a positive representation, think of how much that would really change the community, and maybe even younger individuals who are just coming out to have something to look forward to, right? So here is a very small list. There was a few more, but not many more, sadly. Sorry, everyone. Of anyone who's trans or gender non-conforming. So there's Bridget from Guilty Gear. I can't pronounce this character's name, and I'm so sorry. Cremisius? I haven't played the game yet. Sorry, y'all. Crem? All right, fine. And I'm going to get to Erica last on purpose. There's also Vivian for Paper Mario, Flea from Chrono Trigger, who although is a villain, I love her, so I don't care. And then Birdo from Mario 2, although they're trying to change her gender back to a boy recently, if y'all haven't seen. I was reading something about a more recent game that they were trying to change the gender back. Did you see that?
No.
Yeah, it's for, I don't know what game, but I was reading something that they were debating what to do. Either make Birdo a girl and no other thing, or make, anyway, yeah. So they're trying to retcon this, but I'm gonna ignore that for now too. And then Naoto from Persona 4. So the reason why I left Erica Anderson at the end is because both of us had this issue that when she came up, I had no idea that she was trans. Absolutely no idea. And I played this game. And I have mixed feelings that I didn't know this character was trans, because on the one hand, I'm glad that she was represented just as any other character. On the other hand, I would have loved to know that she was trans and feel like there was any type of inclusivity. Yeah. Right. Yes. So for some reason, even though I read that quote too, yeah, someone sleeps with her and says something like, "Oh, it's really weird." It's some terrible quote the person says. I don't know how, even when I play this game and I do remember that quote, I never remember them saying that she was trans. So maybe I just blocked it out. Because in my mind I was like, oh, why is that guy being a jerk to this person? But yes, so she is trans, and it is interesting that basically the little mention they have of it is treated as a joke, which is disappointing.
Yeah. And I was just thinking too, have any of you read the article that I think, Brianna Wu was a part of, that was about Samus? Yeah, and saying Samus is a trans woman, and the point of the article, one of the points of the article that I thought was really important was saying that, you know, when Brianna made this claim about Samus, that the internet said you have to prove it, but nobody had to prove that Samus could have been cis. And this is one of those things that comes up a lot in the trans community in general, is you have to prove to me who you are. You have to prove to me that you're legitimate. And if there are no examples of people that are saying, like, yes, you are legitimate, you are valid, is exactly as you are, then we're running into this problem a lot. So I wanted to talk a little bit about being a good ally. And one of the things that we see happen a lot are people making assumptions about what it is that communities need. And it's important to listen, to listen to what it is that the folks around you are saying. Even just starting this conversation about the asterisk, is one of those things that we had to listen to folks, we had to listen to each other, and we're suggesting that you listen to the people that you're engaging with. And also to be an advocate, don't be a silent ally. You may be thinking, well, I'm queer identified myself, so that means I'm here, I don't have to do anything. But you do, we all need to be responsible for taking care of each other, being advocates for each other, especially if you have more privilege or more power within the community, to use that to help others, but also know when to step back. Because there might be moments where it's not okay for you to fight that fight. You may not be wanted in that fight, in that moment, and that's okay. But have conversations about when to be a part of it and when to take a step back. But I also wanted to speak specifically to like guilds and clans, and when you're getting together with people. When you're putting a bunch of people together, people are going to come with different ideas, with different opinions, different experiences in life, and you need to have rules and moderation for your group. Moderation being one of the very, very key parts. You have to take action on things that happen. You can't just set up rules and say, oh, no transphobic slurs, and then just ignore them when you see them on Facebook or wherever it is that your group gets together. You really, really have to take a lot of action on that to create a safe space for people. You also have to be willing to accept feedback from people when you're hearing that from your community, and then provide feedback to the community that you are gaming with. So you really, really need to be very active in that process. The other thing that's important to consider is when you're getting a group together, have kind of a standard way of introducing yourselves. Include your name. It can be whatever name, whether it's your gamer tag, your name that you use, whether it's your character name, whatever it is that you want it to be, and pronouns. Have that be an opportunity to talk about pronouns and just make it a standard thing that everybody does. That's one of those things about just kind of evening the playing field for everybody. And that also makes it easier that when you're going into events that might involve voice, that talking about pronouns is it's just a thing you do. It's natural. It's just a part of conversation, so that when you get into a space where you're talking, you say, hi, my name is whatever, my pronouns are whatever, and that can just be part of that conversation, so that nobody's being misgendered in a space that you're trying to create for people to feel safe. Because if any of you are part of some form of LGBT guild or clan that's out there, that's the idea. You found those people because you wanted a safe space. And then the last thing that I would suggest to you all is have time to celebrate people. Have time to celebrate different identities of the folks that are in your group, whether or not those people are a part of your group. They don't have to be just to celebrate folks. And one of the examples I think of, and where this image comes from, is from Guild Wars 2, where recently there was a trans-identified character that was entered as an NPC into the canon, and as part of a guild, one of the guilds that I'm in, that for a Pride event, we started there. We started our Pride, we had like a march around one of the cities. It was fun. I had fun. And when we had our parade around the city, we started there specifically and talked about why that was important. And so that's something that I would encourage you all to do and to ask for if you're a part of one of these communities, that being able to celebrate, again, it's helpful, it's important, it brings people together and can create a more safe space.
So now we're going into, let's say that you do have some mental health concerns, and keep in mind, this doesn't have to be something severe. It could be, but sometimes people just come to see a therapist to talk about relationship concerns or stress with family or at work. So just so you know, you don't have to have a major diagnosis to come in. But let's say that you want to find someone. Part of the issue is when you're in the LGBT community, and today we're talking mostly about trans and gender nonconforming, you have to find someone who actually has similar values, or at least some idea of what the community is. Because the issue is when you don't, then what happens is that you turn into teaching your therapist, which is pretty terrible. When the therapist asks you over and over again, well, what does that mean? Well, what do you want? And they misgender you all the time, and et cetera. And I can say that this is a huge deal. At least where I work right now, people get misgendered constantly. I mean, constantly. And I don't think they even realize, this is other clinicians, how damaging it is to the individual, including even in notes that they're writing about the person. It's like, okay. So you need to figure out, okay, does this person actually understand at least something about the community? Do they have any cultural competency? Or, so basically, do they have any idea of what it's like to be in the community? And when I talk about being culturally humble, it's more when a clinician is able to come to you and say, you know, I don't have a lot of information about the community, but I'm gonna look into it, and I'm gonna be open to your feedback. It's someone who can actually, when you say, hey, that's not my pronoun, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, and they start to actually use the correct one. So there is some possibility for that as well. And also, are they familiar with WPATH at all? I don't know if you want to add to this, but so WPATH is basically the standards of care that we have mostly for trans individuals. If they don't have any idea what this is, you probably want to go somewhere else.
Run.
I mean, it's really bad. This is the standard of care to the point that this is, you know, the book you saw earlier, the DSM. This is the equivalent if someone told you, in their therapist, if they told you, you know what, I don't actually know the DSM. This is the equivalent for me. If someone works with any trans individual and they don't know this, I'd be like, obviously you don't. And also because for people who maybe are looking into having any of the surgeries, top, bottom, all of that, or even getting hormones, this is the standard that we follow as well. So that's why they need to know this.
And a lot of states have moved into an informed consent model, where if you go into a doctor's office and you say, this is a thing that I would like to do, and they say, great, sign here, you know, releasing all responsibility kind of thing. Many states aren't there yet. I'm coming from Texas, and Texas is Texas. And we're kind of in this weird middle ground where informed consent's not really a thing, but they're also not doing that gender identity disorder part that was, you know, way back in the day, not that long ago, I guess, was, you know, you had to be in therapy for a certain number of years, you had to present as your gender identity for a certain number of years and live fully, and all these really unnecessary things. And so like Texas is kind of in the middle. So knowing WPATH is very important because that's the only language a lot of medical providers have. And so if they're not on an informed consent model, WPATH is like, again, like we said, like the Bible for them to follow. And so I think regardless, it's good for a therapist to know. And it outlines mental health care. So if they don't know that, run.
Right, because that means I would assume they had absolutely no training in this yet.
Right.
Which is what the concern is. Right, so when it comes to that, I would say even here in California it's a challenge, so just so you know, it's not just you all. Considering getting people to get a surgery here can be almost impossible, I have recently found out once again. So that's all I'll say on that topic. Well, so going back to access to mental health providers, just know that making appointments can be a challenge, especially depending on what type of insurance you have. And I won't go into that too deeply. I'll just say for those of you who are Medi-Cal, it's going to be really tough for all of you. I work in a Medi-Cal facility, so. When it comes to that, it's figuring out also, does my insurance even cover therapy in the first place? And if it doesn't, can I at least get a sliding scale? And what is that? That means you're going to charge me more based on what I'm making than what you should actually be getting per hour. Like the clinic that Bethany and I work at, this is a different clinic, we have a sliding scale, which is great because it actually goes down to $5, which is insane. And you can get quality care for only $5, I'm just saying. In Palo Alto, if you all want to go. But, so besides that, is there anyone who either serves trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people? Because finding that can be almost impossible. It's going to be much less likely, like Joey was saying earlier, to find someone who actually is in the community, unlikely. But you can find someone who at least has worked with the community before. And also, you know what, traditional therapy actually isn't for everyone. It could be that if you're struggling with something, there are other things in your life that really help you figure that out, and you don't need to come to see us at all. So just do what's best for you. But I added this really briefly because actually I present a lot to especially beginning clinicians about this, and some more experienced ones who don't really understand how to pass the test. But basically what it means is that on both sides, when you're meeting a therapist, you're both trying to test each other, actually. So it's figuring out, are we a good fit? Is this going to work out for me? And it's important for you to do this with your therapist. So are they going to ask you about pronouns at all? Are they even going to use your correct pronouns? Do they assume what sexuality you are? And so when I say that, it's like, do they ask about your partner, or do they assume you have a girlfriend or boyfriend, depending on what gender they assume you are? Things like that you can already start to see, okay, this is a problem. Are they open to feedback with it? Again, do they know anything about the community? Are they even comfortable with people in the community? Do they cringe every time you talk about, I don't know, Folsom, something like that? Like, this is important though, because the communities really overlap, right? So if you talk about that, or if you talk about coming to a gaming convention, are they going to be like, oh, why did you go there? Why is that where you're going? And someone that can just have an open and honest conversation with you, because the point of therapy is for you to go to someone who you feel comfortable with. So you shouldn't be going to someone who you're worried about, who is going to judge you, or that you're concerned about how they're going to treat you.
If you're not comfortable with somebody after that first or second session, it's okay to find somebody new. That's something that a lot of people feels like, well, I've met with this person, this is my therapist, I must meet with them. You don't have to. If you're in an area, thank you. If you're in an area where you can have other choices of providers, find somebody different. That's really okay.
Yeah, and actually, I would say that many therapists, the ones that I actually respect more, I will say, are the ones who put that out there the first session. And also, if you're going to private practice, the people who even offer, you know what, we can meet briefly before we even start anything. Let's actually get to know each other and see if we're a good fit.
The other thing that comes up a lot too is people want to find a therapist that looks like them, that identifies in the same ways that they do, and that can be important. That's absolutely something that you might need, and that might also be something that might be hard to do. And I just also want to put out there the idea that there are a lot of queer therapists out there, thankfully, and there are more and more trans-identified therapists out there. But keep in mind that just because they may identify the same way as you doesn't mean it's always going to be a good fit for you. There are a lot of folks out there that because of their identity, they're more likely to be helpful to you, they're more likely to be affirming of your identities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be good from it just because you know that fact about them.
Well, right, because I mean, as we've been saying through the presentation, that's not the only part of your identity, right? So you also have to find the therapist that you actually kind of get along with, and maybe you have similar ideas of what you should be working on. And so that's only one aspect of what you should be looking at.
Yeah, and so what I hope at least that you're getting from this is that there's a lot to navigate in a mental health system, and it's important to know what those things are, because if you're turning to a certain institution for help, for support, and you kind of need to know what you're going into, because it can be a really hard system to navigate, especially if you don't already have those resources, financial privileges, things like that can make it easier to do otherwise.
So that's our presentation. We'll leave at least a little bit for any questions. Thank you so much. And just if you need it, here's all our contact information right up on the screen.
Hi, if you're in the Sacramento area, hello? Okay, if you're in the Sacramento area, there is a place called the Gender Health Center, and they offer mental health services and transitioning services for those, for transgender individuals, sorry. And they have a sliding scale of payment, like based on your income, but they won't turn away someone for inability to pay. They give counseling services to everyone of any gender, sexual orientation, sex. Like they will give counseling, like mental health services to everyone.
Well, and I think that's really helpful. There might be some people here who are a little bit further north, and I just want to add that UCSF has a similar program for any of you who are local. So in San Francisco, we have one as well. Thank you for sharing that.
I'd also want to add to that real quick too, that this is how a lot of this knowledge gets around. Talk to people, find out what services they're receiving from whom. Do they like it? Do they not? That word of mouth is absolutely important.
So two things. First off, as an employer, what would be the best ways to engage in those conversations, especially in regards to the healthcare and everything that you were just talking about? And then second off, in terms of being a good ally, in terms of facilitating the standard introduction with pronouns and community events to celebrate different identities, especially if you have a user base who may not be very familiar with those concepts, or they might be too young to have ever been introduced to those kind of things, how can you go about introducing those concepts in a way that wouldn't be alienating to either party?
I can talk a little bit about this, and maybe you can add to it, Joey. I think it can be really tough to start introducing this in either place, right, as an employer or to your user base. But if you start having like pride events, not just for LGBT community, but maybe for other things as well, or other identities, that could be a start. I think the issue is that you will probably definitely alienate someone. Just by the nature of it, I think it's hard not to. So the companies I've seen that have done really well, I'm just thinking when marriage equality finally passed, there were quite a few companies that made it really obvious that they were supporting the LGBT community. And just looking at the backlash they got some backlash from some people, but they also got a bigger fan base, user base in a sense, right? So it's being able to deal with, I'm gonna get some negative critique, but we're okay with handling that. So that's what came to mind first for me.
I was also thinking too that if you're talking from the perspective of an employer or somebody who's managing a community, you really do have to take those stances to say we need to be more inclusive, we need to be welcoming, and we need to have these standard ways, and we might need to provide some education to get that started. Having that kind of advocacy is where a lot of this starts. So it might turn some people off at first, but the idea is that we're trying to be more inclusive in the longer run, and it's sometimes just part of that process. But from an employment side, it is very hard because you're dealing with a lot of politics, you're dealing with a lot of business aspects of things, and sometimes you just got to keep asking, keep pushing, keep being that advocate, and just not giving up on it. Other questions? I know we're really close on time. We had to get started late, so okay. Last one, I think.
What's your favorite color?
Mine's blue.
I think mine is purple most of the time.
Green.
Thank you.
We're absolutely available for questions. Email, whatever.
Yeah, have a great con. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.